This is Discover Allah 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. I bear witness that there's no deity worthy of worship except Allah, and I bear witness that Muhammad is the final messenger, seal of prophets. Today I'm going to be exposing the lies of one of these missionaries in Speaker's Corner called Bob the Builder, who seems to have replaced the other liar, the J. Smith. And he's spreading lies concerning history, whitewashing history when it comes down to the true historical accounts, which are recorded by also non-Muslims when it comes down to the truth, when it comes down to Christian history, when it comes down to the truth, when it comes down to Islam and its inspiration, the inspiration that the Europeans took to give birth to the Renaissance when it had sunk into the Dark Ages. Christianity had 600 years prior to Christ to be advanced, to seek knowledge, be advanced. If they had any divine inspiration, they would have flourished just like Islam did in a small amount of time. Now, when it comes down to these Christian missionaries such as Bob the Builder, he tries to whitewash history blatant, where people can research history and they can see that their missionaries are liars. They're the biggest liars ever. I swear by God, by Allah Almighty, Wallahi, they're the biggest liars. Whitewash, even if you prove to them, you tell them that Europe had sunk into the Dark Ages. You tell them that they had 600 years and they had sunk into the Dark Ages. They believed that science was superstition and witchcraft. And also when it comes down to the human rights, Bob the Builder was saying that the Christians founded human rights way before the Muslims did. And this is a complete, utter lie. First of all, you have to go back to history when it comes down to what nearly happened to Jesus Christ. And we believe it happened to Judas, or another Jesus, a person by the name of Jesus of Nazareth. Now, when it comes down to it, Bob the Builder is a complete, utter liar. Because if you want to know what happened to most of the disciples and the Nazarenes were wiped out and replaced by pagan Gentile Christians, sun god worshippers. These Nazarenes were fed to the lions. They were taken to Rome, to the Colosseums, tortured, executed, fed to the lions, the Nazarenes, the true followers of Jesus, the original Israelite Christians. And also the disciples, most of them were killed. So when Bob the Builder says they founded the Human Rights Act, this is utter complete rubbish. Church and state had to be separated so that they could advance in science after they had learned and picked up knowledge from the Muslims of Andalus, Muslim Spain, and Baghdad of Iraq. So this is how, at that time, they were really appalling when it came down to treating the people, the common people, such as if old woman was suspected, she would be burned to death if she was suspected of witchcraft. We know what happened to Joan of Arc, who wasn't an elderly as well, but she was suspected of witchcraft and she was put to death. So I thought I would give some references from non-Muslim sources to these ignorant Christian missionaries, because they won't let you talk. I tried to explain to them, even when it came down to the Black Death of Europe. Now they tried to spread some other some false information in the net that it wasn't just Europe that was facing the Black Death. Now maybe other societies didn't know that, but it wasn't the Muslim societies, because when it came down to the Muslims of Spain, for example, when the Europeans, such as the people who were facing the Black Death, when they went to Muslim Spain, they noticed that the inhabitants of the land, the Muslims, were not contracting the virus of the Black Death. And they noticed one thing, that they also ate with their hands as well, and they weren't contracting the Black Death. They knew that it had something to do with hygiene issues, the lack of hygiene, and that the only way that Europe can be saved from the Black Death was to introduce knives, forks, and spoons that was mostly inspired or taken from surgical equipment like tools, and they transformed these tools, like the idea of these tools, into knives, forks, and spoons. So they had to go back to Europe and introduce spoons, knives, and forks to control the virus and get rid of it. And this is how Europe was saved from the Black Death. Even convert Muslim, I forgot his name, a convert Muslim who was an ex-Christian, he's South African, and even he will say that you will not find this in the modern day history books, but can be found in the libraries, in old history texts of the Europeans, of the European race, of the nations of Europe. And you have to go back to the old history books will tell you this, how knives and forks and spoons were introduced to Europe, and about the Black Death, and how the civilization of Europe was saved because they went to Muslim Spain, and they knew it was due to hygiene, lack of hygiene, for them to be contracting the Black Death. So I thought I'll give you some references, and this is not from this is from a non-Muslim source, the Irish Times, and it was the book of the day, which they had chosen, called The House of Wisdom: How the Arabs Transformed Western Civilization, by Jonathan Lyons, Bloomsbury. This man was a historian and router correspondent when it comes down to it. Now, this is what it says. I'll give you the references on what it said. The timing is apt. Now that Barack Obama's America seeks consolation rather than confrontation in the Middle East, here is a thoughtful book revealing how Islamic culture helped the West to emerge from the Dark Ages into the Renaissance. Now, when I explained this before I even found this source, this knowledge, I came across it on the net yesterday. When I've been explaining this to Bob the Builder, and he just likes to blab on and saying we're liars and we're doing taqiyah. They love to use the word taqiyah, when we can prove it. Even non-Muslims can prove it. Historians, if they're sincere, they can prove it. So as you can see, author Jonathan Lyons, Bloomsbury, is well qualified for the task, they say. He spent many years as a Reuters foreign correspondent in Islam and is affiliated with the Global Terrorism Research Centre at Monash University in Melbourne. As he describes, it was centuries of Arab scholarship that enabled Copernicus, Galileo, Newton, Einstein and their successors to develop in mathematics and cosmology. Lyons' history validates the proposition that science transcends rival national ideologies in consideration of how Iraq has been devastated in the past few years. It is ironic to reflect that Baghdad was founded 1,246 years ago and soon afterwards became a supreme center of international intellectual enlightenment. Now, due to the Caliph of Abu Ja'far al-Mansur, the founder built a great library in Baghdad, Lyons relates, modeled after those of great Persian kings. Arab chroniclers, scholars later praised his mastery of logic and law and his interest in philosophy and astronomy, and gave him credit for directing translation into Arabic of numerous important works by Greek, Persian, and Hindu philosophers and scientists. Data were gathered from across the widespread Islamic empire for development by Baghdad's men of learning. His library was named the House of Wisdom. Arabs adopted the efficient Hindu decimal system with the 9 numerals and 0 we use today on the basis of Euclid's geometry and Ptolemy's astronomy. The Arabs devised algebra and trigonometry and made astronomical observations of their own. At a time when the Christians of Europe, I repeat, Bob the Builder, the Christians of Europe believed the world was flat, found it difficult to fix the date of Easter and could not even tell the time of day. The Arabs, aided by a gadget called the astrolabe, made astronomical and terrestrial measurements to discover that our world is spherical and to calculate its size almost exactly. The astrolabe was also a valuable navigational instrument determining latitude. The Arabs made great progress in cartography, chemistry, and medicine at a time when the Christian church was telling adherents that disease were divine punishments from human sins. Flagellations was one of the atonements for the Black Death. Now, in every discipline, Arab scholars were assisted by the manufacture of paper, while Europe's relatively few literates, I repeat, Europe's few literates were writing on cumbersome and expensive parchment. Libraries in Islam that contained hundreds of thousands of volumes when books in Europe were very scarce. Lyons traces the influences of Plato, Aristotle, Augustine, and Thomas Aquinas on the Arabs. Today, many tend to see religion as the enemy of scientific progress, Lyons writes. Yet early Islam openly encouraged and nurtured intellectual inquiry of all kinds. Muhammad himself said, "Seek for science even to China." I think this is a weak hadith according to the scholars, but since copying is introduced to us and as a sunnah of the Prophet, peace be upon him, which the Chinese also practice, maybe it's authentic. I have to check that out. Allah knows best. In contrast with the Crusaders who rampaged through the Holy Land at the end of the 11th century, there were European scholars such as Adelard of Bath and Michael Scott who traveled to Islam, the Islamic Empire, and brought back Arabic texts for translation into Latin and beyond. Cultural go-betweens connecting East and West were helped by Muslims in Sicily and Spain to transmit knowledge. So when maybe Bob the Builder is very ignorant to how, if he mentions or he says it was Christian posts that were practicing science, this is some information concerning how they got the information to do this and where they got it from, and they got it from Arab texts and Islam. So Bob the Builder, you have been exposed as a liar to say the Christians were first to be practicing science when you got it all from Arab texts and translating it into Latin. So the House of Wisdom is an exciting collection of facts and ideas that stimulate the imagination. There has always been more than oil in the Middle East. This is in the Irish Times, and the book of the day called the book of the day called The House of Wisdom: How the Arab Transformed Western Civilization by Jonathan Lyons, Bloomsbury. So as you can see, when Bob the Builder and missionaries such as him try to come to Speaker's Corner and have a platform to lie against Islam, they whitewash history. And they're trying to steal Islamic identity and give us theirs when it comes down to science, the advancement of science, when it comes down to slavery, terrorism, etc., etc. We all know Salah ad-Din al-Ayyubi, he gave amnesty to the European Crusaders and the people that were in Jerusalem, that occupied Jerusalem at that time. He could have slaughtered them all, but he gave them amnesty and let them go back to Europe untouched and unharmed after the Crusaders had demolished and killed many Muslims and Jews, even Christians that looked like Middle Easterners. So as you can see, I thought I'd give some information and expose this Bob the Builder as a liar, because when it comes down to Human Rights Act and also the advancement of science, church and state had to be separated for you to practice science. And so as you can see, Bob the Builder and the missionaries are liars. So we saved Europe from the Black Death if it wasn't for Islam and the contact of the Christians with the Muslims at that time, and them going back to Europe. They would have died of extinction from the Black Death. Now they always say, prove this, prove this, prove this. You can check it out, and best thing for you to go is go to old history books instead of reading the modern day ones, which are whitewashed history. Because history is being whitewashed today, especially by Christian missionaries who try to say Islam's got no rights for women, when Islam founded the rights for women. Rights, we don't mean equality. Rights and equality are two different things. Rights means giving them their rights that they have without, like, basically at that time before Islam, there was an abortion when it came down to young girls. When women were born, women were treated like animals, like bred like sheep to be kept like. And so I thought and then Islam, Muhammad peace be upon him, came and he gave rights for the women. And this is in the 7th century, whereas women in the West were fighting for their rights 100 years ago. So as you can see, I thought I would expose Bob the Builder and other missionaries with their lies concerning the history of Islam. And I gave a reference from a non-Muslim source, and by this person, Jonathan Lyons, Bloomsbury, and also the Irish Times, concerning this book you should read if you're non-Muslims. And for you to research, and do not believe the Christian missionaries or the Christians. They're the biggest lies. When they talk about us spreading propaganda and taqiyah, we're making taqiyah, we're lying. We're not lying. We're telling the truth that even non-Muslim scholars and historians will back up if they're sincere and if they're not Christians. So I thought I would inform the people and show them the truth when it comes down to history, that it was Islam that gave birth to the Renaissance. The days of enlightenment of Europe being raised up from the Dark Ages had to do with the contact with Muslims and their scholars that advanced even the European civilization and the civilization you see today. This is Discover Allah 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7.